Page 225 of The Unfolding is the story of Bob Goff.
It's easy to love your enemies until you have an enemy. But when you feel somebody has betrayed you, that's when it gets real. And that's when I feel like heaven is leaning over the rails. Matthew 8:19, it says, all of creation is up on their tiptoes, just waiting to see what the sons and daughters do next. If we started seeing our lives and our faith as like dazzling the angels, it would make a huge difference in the way that you approach yourself.
God's story has been unfolding.
Since the beginning of time.
He invites you to be a part of it.
Another page in The Unfolding.
God is over the moon about you. Do you believe that? Hey, this is Meredith Foster. Bob Goff has spent decades trying to convince people that it's true. God is over the moon about you. Not because of what you have or haven't done, but because he created you and he is love. If you struggle to believe God loves you, if you long to live a life of adventure and wonder, Bob Goff's story is the one you want to hear. Bob is known as the guy who included his phone number in the back of his first book, Love Does, because he loves people. And he wants to be available. Since then, he's written multiple New York Times best-selling books and included his number in every one of them. Bob says his greatest ambition is to love people and inspire others to follow Jesus into a life of adventure, whimsy, wonder, and passion, fueling your ability to give and receive extravagant love. His new book, Catching Whimsy, is all about that. It's an invitation to wake up each day expecting to live a more meaningful life, a more engaged faith, and a more intentional future.
I was thinking back to my earliest memory of a person who said they were a Christian, because I didn't grow up in church and I didn't know anybody who did go to church. But there's this one guy named Doug who was just nuts. And we would go out shooting pellet guns and we'd find old cans to shoot at. And we were in the woods. And then Doug was no longer at my side. I was looking around and all I could see was the muzzle of his pellet gun pointed at me because I had become the next can. And so I did what I was prone to do, which is run. It's this fight or flight kind of thing. And I was out of there. And I turned around to kind of defend myself with my wimpy little BB gun. And he shot me. It went like in me. It didn't like a welt like you get with paintball. Like there's this pellet like an inch inside of me.
Oh my goodness.
We go back to his house and he gets some tweezers and we're going to do this operation on me to get this pellet out. And we're putting mouthwash in to have a sterile environment. And he goes in me. And as he's got the tweezers inside of me, he's fishing around for this thing. He starts telling me about Jesus. I'm like, you shot me. I didn't think that was allowed. But evidently it wasn't. He was just my nutty friend that showed me that faith was accessible. If it could work for a guy like him, it could certainly work for a guy like me. And I was kind of out there and I was a happy kid, not the bright kid. I wouldn't be trying out for the chess team. But I had a lot of joy, and I noticed that a lot of people that were kind of unconventional in the way that they were approaching life had this thing in common that they really wanted that idea of, come to give life and more of it. Because the interactions I had, although really limited, there were people that looked like they had scowls tattooed on their face, and these were the Christians, and they were all just really kind of wimpy and like they not doing much. And I'm giving you the vantage point of a high school kid that saw that. And I just go, no, thanks. Like, is that whole, like, I've come to give you more life. They had a bunch of things to say. I remember a guy asked me, have you been washed in the blood? I'm like, of course not. Like, what the heck? And he said, like saved. I'm like, dude, no. All those words, I think it was at that point that I started not having a bias against those things, but I just loved how Jesus spoke to people in plain language. He didn't use code. He didn't do anything. And so here we are 11 books later, and I write books for people who I would describe as church adjacent. So they're not the person in the front row of the church. They're not making fun of the church or poking fun or saying something snide or snarky about the church. They're people that work at the tire store. They're like across the way. They know what's going on generally. They just don't want to get any on them, any of the like crazy stuff. And so I can really identify because that's where I was and where I still remain. Yeah, I want people to kind of smell the cookies in the oven and just invite people in to say, like, come and see. I love that Jesus didn't tell everybody where he was going, who he was going with, what would happen when they got there. So it wasn't a business trip, it was an adventure that he was inviting them on. And this whole idea of whimsy is that's just starting to see your life, the things that are happening. If you've ever blown a bubble as a kid and then try to catch it on the wand, that there's that idea of being engaged, that faith wasn't just a set of values, it wasn't just a set of beliefs and doctrine, but that there was actually some action that was incorporated at knowing full well that God doesn't need our help, but that he wants our hearts. I think he wants our attention. I think he wants us to bring all the joy we can muster.
Who was one of the first people that you saw who engaged their faith in that way that you were like, now that I could get on board with?
Oh yeah, Doug, my assassin friend. Like he was it was just nuts. And I found if you've ever gone through the day and your shirt's untucked and you realize at the end of the day that you're one button off, and so you haven't noticed, but your collar's been crooked all day. Nobody said anything, but there's something about that I feel like the people that are a button or two off in their faith are the people that have helped me understand mine the best. Because it wasn't just like putting up a statue or something green screened to look like something. They were just really obviously a little disheveled. Like they were just trying to just keep the tires on this thing. And my perception of the, 12 disciples, and one of them, Jesus' own Sunday school class went bad on him. So like those ideas of people that are living not erratic lives, but fallible lives. What I want us to do is understand that. And we're not aiming for perfection. We're aiming for Jesus. So we're not trying to be a better version of ourselves. We're trying to be a more accurate reflection of him. For me, I'm not there, but I'm like, that is the catching whimsy part. I'm trying to endeavor to be there. That idea of not helping Jesus out, but to understand and to bring all the joy that we can and get into some kind of like wonderful mischief. I just got back a couple weeks ago from Uganda and I've been there probably 30 or 40 times over the last 20 years. And we started with a school of 9 kids. I'm sure 8 of them didn't want to be there. We were over there to graduate 1,500 kids in their little uniforms, and they all live on campus. So it's no small place. It's this city, and we've just broke ground on a university, which cracks me up because my worst subject in school was school. But this would be the whimsy part. We decided we were going to start a zoo, but they said it's not a zoo. It's supposed to be called a habitat. I'm like, whatever, it's a zoo. So we wanted to find an animal that wouldn't bite people. It would be hard to lose. I'm like, giraffes. And so I don't know the president of Uganda who owns all of the giraffes in Uganda, 2,470, but I know his wife. And so I was meeting with her and I was telling her all about the giraffes. And then she ran over and grabbed him by the ear. And we sat down for an hour and just talked giraffes. And I walked out of that meeting with 6 giraffes.
Oh my goodness.
Whimsy will ask that question. Like, how do they deliver a giraffe standing up? They put him on the back of a truck, standing up with a bunch of leaves around him so they can eat the leaves, and they transport him. What I want us to do, if faith guides people's steps, is to engage the world around you and don't go across an ocean, go across the street. That idea, like, that love your neighbor, because it's easy to sound noble and do something far away. What if we do the kinds of things Jesus was talking about and do right where you live? And you can do it today. You make somebody a pie. If they don't want it, I do. That idea. Like to get practical with this, like you have neighbors on your street. There's no shame in this, but you don't know who they are. Maybe they've been, maybe somebody moved out, maybe you never got around to it, or you feel like you were imposing. Why not just go over with a Christmas ornament or with a apple pie or with a whatever and just introduce yourself? Say like, I just realized I wanted to send you a Christmas card and we had never really kind of met each other. So there's no shame in it. It isn't like somebody pointing a bony finger in your direction. And sometimes in our faith communities, you get that sense. That's why a lot of people are church adjacent, because they just don't want to have somebody scold them.
Mm-hmm.
But there's something about being invitational. Instead of waiting it for it to happen to me, what if I were to chase that down? Chase it like it was somebody had something of mine. Like if they ran out the door, actually, anybody can steal my old pickup truck. It's all yours. The keys are probably in it. Do me a favor. But if somebody had something and took off with it, I'd probably want to go after it because I'd say, like, that's mine. And yet, sometimes our whimsy, sometimes our joy, it just, we don't know who swiped it or exactly how that happened, but it's like it's gone. And if you lose your keys, you say, where was the last place I saw them? And you go back to that place. So if you've lost your joy, when was the last time you remember really being joyful? If you've lost your sense of love or affection for people or trust of other people, say, well, what's the crime scene? I'm not saying campsite there, but find the little chalk outline, which was you, and then say, I'm going to return there and say, put the pieces back together.
One of the phrases I've heard you use is that when you're talking about how God loves us, you describe him as being over the moon about us. And I love that because there's something even whimsical about that phrase. But I think there are many of us who don't believe that. And that's at the root of not chasing whimsy, is that we're not convinced that God has good things for us. There's a chapter in Catching Whimsy. It's about anticipating good. Like our default setting is that he's got good things for us. He really is over the moon for us. Why do you think it is that we are so afraid he isn't and he's in a bad mood?
Yeah, sometimes we make these rules along the way. It happens to all of us. If you remember back in high school, do you remember having like the first person you touched knees with on purpose, that you just, your heart was a flutter? Do you remember who that was? You don't need to say his name, but
Sure.
like, okay, there was that moment, because then when you touch knees, you were a thing, right? So you had the DTR back in the days, like you kind of like define the relationship. And sometimes what'll happen is that we'll have these moments like that just we can just bring us right back to that. It's a smell, it's a song, it's whatever, and it brings us right back to that moment. And other times there's something that'll bring us back to something that was actually very damaging to us. It was very hurtful. It really got to the core of who we are. Let's say you had your first sweetheart and then they split or they betrayed that friendship or whatever. So sometimes then you'll make a rule, and the rule is that everyone's going to leave me. And it isn't true, but it feels true. And you create this scaffolding around your life to protect your little heart, because your heart is not ready to deal with grown-up emotions, and you're actually not even as a grown-up have the shelves to deal with some of that stuff. So that scaffolding that was helpful when you were 11 or 15 ends up turning in later to this imprisoning thing. Like the scaffolding was there to guard your heart when you're feeling all these emotions. But now I remember, for me, I'm like 24 and can't get a date. And it's because I made the rule, I'm not going deep with anybody. And the rule, I'm not going deep with anybody, is because of the belief that I created, which is everybody's going to leave me, because some wonky stuff happened early on that made me think everybody's going to leave. So here's the rule. And then the outcome is to say, man, I can't go deep with anybody. And so part of it is to say, what is that connected to? So if you say, I'm not sure God is that loving, that's probably connected to some life lived experiences that you had, and then you made some rules or some questions around that. I don't think God is a loving God. And so I'm not trying to talk you out of the rule. I'm just saying, let's go back to the crime scene. Let's see what was going. Was it true then? Does it need to still be true? Is there anything you could make it happen in the future that would disprove that would replace that with a better truth, a more accurate truth? So instead of trying to put your finger on the scale, and because you know where you want to end up, remember those high school aptitude tests you took? They said, like, you want to be an airplane pilot. When you ask questions, like, they'd say, where's your favorite place to be? And you'd say, in the air. And then they'd say, what's your favorite birds? Like things with wings. Like, so you could kind of weight your answers, trying to like kind of influence the outcome. And so I think we can still do that. We can go back and we say, where did I lose my joy? And let me return to that place, and to say where it was lost is whatever. And don't get lost in that level of introspection, but to be encouraged to say, okay, and so what I did is I made this rule that I'm only going so deep with people. Or I know somebody who's advanced in years, they were giving me some advice. They say, like, in the Depression, banks ran out of money and people lost their jobs and things are scarce. So you need to hang on to everything that you have. And so what they were trying to do is express love to me, but they instilled fear. I'm like, yikes, maybe I should hang on to everything. And then I did the math not too long ago, and I realized this person was 7 years old when the Depression ended. Like, they grew up in happy days. They didn't grow up in the Depression at all, but their parents grew up in the Depression. And their parents tried to instill, no doubt, love in them. And they said, people will lose their jobs and banks will run out of money and you need to hang on everything. So that was instilled in them. And so they tried to express love to me. And what they did is they scared me. Like, my goodness, I must have to hang on to everything. And so we'll go back to the origin story, figure out where did that get started, and then understand some context for that, that this was a really loving person who didn't know how to express love well without scaring people. And it wasn't intended to be manipulative, but it felt manipulative. So I'm not just saying like don't need to scold people. We just need to understand what was the context for whatever was happening. I'm a recovering lawyer, so people ask me for advice all the time. Say, what's your advice? And what I do instead is I'll give them my experience. Like, I don't say, here's my advice. I've sailed across the ocean a couple times, which is so funny because I hurl the whole way. It's like, I don't know why I keep doing, I was just mad at myself. But there was a guy telling me, bring these sails and this food and this life raft. And I said, oh, are you a sailor? And he said, no, I've never left Ohio. He had a lot of opinions. He just didn't have any lived experience to back those up. And so I would say, when you're in this adventure and you're talking to other people, ask them their lived experiences. Don't ask their opinions. So if they have an opinion about relationships, I'd say, hey, tell me about your 4 best relationships. And if he says, well, on my 3rd wife, now you have some context, not to disprove, but to understand the context within which I'm getting sailing advice.
So whimsy and faith. I mean, you've written about it a lot. I remember even the introduction to Love Does, you talked about whimsy. This is something you have been thinking about embracing for a long time. So whimsy and faith, why are they such an important relationship, the two things together?
Yeah, I think they go hand in hand. I write, this is a devotional, Catching Whimsy. And in the rest of my books, I don't put any Bible verses because that wouldn't have meant anything to me. And I'm a guy that writes trial briefs. I'm like, I get it. If you want to prove something, I'm right and this is why. But I'm not trying to talk people into or out of their faith. And yet I'm a Bible verse guy. Like, I'm just trying to understand this. And I've, read a lot of them. I don't always incorporate them into my life, but I'm working on it. That idea to find that nexus between that joy that made me smell the cookies in the oven and then the practical, like the kind of meat and potatoes of faith, like understanding why it is that you believe what you believe. I'm a big fan of that. And again, if faith guides your steps, sometimes it's helpful to have a context to say, like, actually, this is if I believe these things to be true in the scriptures, which are just books and letters. Somehow when you just call them the Bible, I'm not against it. It's fine. You can call it whatever you want. But it's just books and letters. And they're books and letters that are all put together. And I'm not diminishing the importance. I'm probably among the ultra Orthodox people, but I'm so Orthodox that I believe that God loves everybody. He loves the screwed up kid and the person that's whacked out. And I believe that Jesus didn't die just so we'd behave better. It's not about just behavior driven. I think it's like, so we would understand our heart, we would understand his heartbeat. And I know that he delights when we make progress. And that's the different camera angle. That's like that shift. Do you remember somebody that you loved and they took their first step? They're like a year old. I bet my boys were 7, but like when they took their first step. And I didn't say, I've seen better. I'm like, no, I'm like, that's awesome. Look at that. You took a step. And I feel like God feels the same way. As a good father, he would see us shuffle our feet forward and he'd just be delighted in that we made some progress. And yet sometimes in our context, we're evaluating people's steps. and we don't think you've stepped far enough or well enough or intentionally enough or whatever enough. And everybody's a critic. Everybody's got something to say about everything. And so what I try to do is it's just like turn down the squelch. On a radio, if you're getting a lot of sound, you just turn down the squelch a little bit and you hear less of that. So that's what I'm trying to do constantly. I'm not just trying to find people that agree with me, but where their hearts beat the same, that we're looking for hope in what seemed like hopeless circumstances. You're looking for an opportunity when it seems like, how could you do that? I'm like, how do you end up with 6 giraffes? I know evidently you just ask. What I would say is I'd modify whimsy by saying there's a strategic whimsy, right? So there's a bunch of probably joy on the surface that's authentic, but underneath that veneer of joy is a mile of strategy. You actually know why you're doing what you're doing. You can have a hope without a plan is a wish. And I'm not wishing on shooting stars. I'm putting all my chips on Jesus. I'm counting on that. And however, I'm adopting a plan, right? You're in a dispute with somebody and you feel like you've been wronged. Maybe if faith guides your steps, you go to the scriptures. What do you do? Matthew 18 has some suggestions. There's some other scriptures that have some suggestions about what you might do next. And so I'd be guided by that and do some hard stuff. Don't do the thing that maybe is the easy thing to do, but to say, dig a little deeper and say like, wow, what would happen if I actually did that? If I moved from agreeing with Jesus to actually doing stuff that he said to do. And it gets crazy. It's easy to love your enemies until you have an enemy. You can cross that stitch on all the pillows you want. But when you feel somebody has betrayed you, that's when it gets real. And that's when I feel like heaven is leaning over the rails. This is Matthew 8:19. It says, all of creation is up on their tiptoes, just waiting to see what the sons and daughters do next. I love that. I'm just picturing heaven on its tiptoes, just waiting to see. Now, you have a God who knows what's happened, is happening, is going to happen. But if we started seeing our lives and our faith as like dazzling the angels, like they're on their tiptoes, just waiting to see what'll happen next, that would be actually a change in perspective that would make a huge difference in the way that you approach yourself.
For Bob, whimsy really is about looking for audacious ways to demonstrate love. So where do the ideas for this kind of adventurous life come from? And how can we live a life more like that? Many of the stories that you share about doing something whimsical seem like spur of the moment creativity just, exploded all of a sudden. But that strategy behind it that makes it beautiful, they're often driven by demonstrating love to someone. That seems to be the thread that runs through so many of the stories. And I just wonder if you could just describe, what does it look like to catch whimsy day to day for you? Like, what are just things that, even in the last couple of weeks that you've done or seen or experienced?
Well, first of all, I'm a huge note taker. I will send myself in a typical day between 100 and 150 emails.
What?
I get home, I'm like, him again, block. I get my head on a swivel. I'm listening for things that people are saying, looking for circumstances, just go like, that actually was something really beautiful that played out. Whether we have a mail carrier who doesn't seem to be very detail oriented and just kind of gives the mail to everybody. He just gets it in the right zip code and calls it good. But there's something really beautiful about having all the neighbors meet at 5 p.m. in the middle of the street to sort out who gets whose mail. And we learned everybody's name. And so to find those things that are happening that just are a little bit ironic and then taking note of it. And then if I don't have my iPhone nearby, I just write it on the palm of my hand with a pen, like the original Palm Pilot. My first habit is to just take notes of everything. If there's a scripture that makes sense to me, then the second thing I do is I did away with having quiet times because that felt like time out to me. I bet I'm 30 years clean and sober on quiet times. Mine are super loud. Like I just take everything that I emailed myself the day before and I'll search the scriptures. I'll do what Paul said, just say just see if it's true. And if I figure out that it's actually true, or it makes a connection to something that I believe is true and lasting, then I might put it in a book. And if it isn't, I just never write it again. So that whole idea of vetting the things that you say. And then the third thing I do is I think about who I'm going to meet with that day. And then I would never show up at your house for dinner empty-handed.
Hmm.
Like I wouldn't come to your door and say, what's for supper? I would have something, like I would bring something. And so I want to bring something to each conversation that I have. I would say, what do I have uniquely to bring, not to educate people, but to actually show up? The fourth thing that I tried to do is actually incorporate this stuff. So Matthew 25 talks about hungry people and thirsty and sick and strange and naked people and people in jail. And tomorrow we're up in San Quentin with some guys at a class I've been teaching for years and years. I think I've had over 800 guys in the class over the years. It's like old home week. Like I know everybody on the yard at San Quentin. I've got a little card at the front gate that lets me get into people's cells and stuff. So
Wow.
there's something that really wins some about that, not to go and teach people, but to learn from them.
Hmm.
And now they've got these little pads and they send me emails all day long. So we're talking to these guys, and there's something really beautiful and disruptive. Like I can't get a thing done because I got my cell phone number in the back of 3 million books. I got 800 guys at San Quentin that have my email address and all these other things. I just love being responsive to people, like just answering somebody's email. There was a guy, I know I'm dating myself, but his name is Keith Green, one of the original contemporary Christian singer-songwriters. And he wrote me a letter because it was before computers. He wrote me a letter and it had 3 sentences long. I felt like such a boss because like Keith freaking Green wrote me a letter.
No kidding.
I don't even remember all these years later. I get 200 or 300 emails a day and everybody gets 3 sentences. And they're not the same 3 sentences. I just remembered it mattered to me so much. I felt really seen. I felt valued. I felt like we were a community of friends that hadn't met yet. And I think there was just something really beautiful about that. That's Philippians 2:20. It's Paul talking about Timothy. He said, the thing about Timothy is that he takes a genuine interest in everybody around him. So when I think about the practical, like catching whimsy thing, is to take a genuine interest in the people around you and see what happens.
Well, I think that's one of the things that is why we feel so inspired when we read Love Does or we read any of your books. It makes you come away thinking about, so many of us are used to going through life so focused on, I just got to get it done, got to get the tasks done, I got to get focused on those things, and just becoming more awake to the world around us and living in a way, living with anticipation. It's so much lighter, so much more free and light than being weighted down with expectations.
I really like the idea of being engaged in the things. I was learning how to fly a plane, and that's where I was riding this morning. And you take your solo flight. So no more instructor, just you. And you go out onto the runway and you're like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. And then when you throw in all the throttle and then at about 50 miles an hour, you're up in the air. And they teach you how to scan the horizon so you don't clobber somebody else. They look everything real quick and then you chunk it up into 10% of the sky. You just take a hard look at 10% of the sky and then take another hard look at 10% of the sky to go a little deeper. And I think that's when I think of faith, what I'm trying to do is take a little harder look at just 10% of my life. Instead of saying, how's everything going? What if we just chunk it up a little bit and say, how are the relationships going? How are the friendships that are going? And what about the things that with each of the kids and the people that you married and the people you're like to just really chunk it up a little bit and take a hard look. And on this solo flight, I remember like leveling the wings and the worst thing you could do is like hit another airplane, right? And so you're always scanning. And sure enough, there's this airplane in the distance. This is a wee little thing. And it looks like we're on the same altitude in the same direction because it ain't moving. It's not going ahead of me or behind me. It's like, I'm like, oh, yikes. So not to freak out, I like went up a couple thousand feet to think, well, on this. And at the same time, this airplane decided to go up a couple thousand feet. And now it's a little bit bigger. And I'm like, oh my God. So I steered a little bit left. It's like this guy or gal flying this plane knew what I was doing because they steered a little bit left and it's still right there. And now I'm a little bit alarmed because it's getting bigger and we are on a collision course. So now I think I'm going to descend pretty rapidly and get out of the way. And I think they must have been reading the same memo because they did. And now it's right. You know what it was? It was a bug on the window. I'm like, oh my gosh. When I talked myself off the ledge, I realized that these things that we're trying to avoid, sometimes they aren't what they appear to be. And so when we take a harder look, we can actually call things what they actually are. That's a bug on the window. That's not a looming airliner. It's not a 747 heading in your direction. It's this small thing that, because it's close, looks like a big thing. And so what my practice would be to do in these very loud times is to search the scriptures and say, like, there are times where something that was small felt like it got really loud. To maybe search my life experience. What's something right now that feels really close and present and really large? It's the one thing I'm spending a weird amount of time thinking about that might be just a kind of a bug in the window. And so that kind of introspection can be really helpful to just chunk it up a little bit, particularly at a time where life feels confusing, or relationships or finances or whatever. Let's start seeing what the pieces are, because once we can see it, then our brains can understand it. Then we can take it to Jesus to do something about. But if it's just like, I'm stressed out, I totally get that feeling, but let's just chunk it up a little bit and just stressing you out. It's this relationship that's out of whack. It's this job that was a great job when I got it, but it just isn't a great job for me now because I've changed and the job didn't. There's no bad guy. It's just like we're new creations. We change all the time. And if you are, then get to the action step and say, what am I going to do about it? On my first day of getting any job, I always write my resignation letter, and I'll address it to my boss. I'll give it to Sweet Maria. I'll put a stamp on it. And I'll say, if this job ever gets in between me and you, or me and Jesus, you just mail that thing in. You don't even need to tell me. I'll find out. That would be some extreme whimsy. So that whole idea to like know your tells, and then to, with some joy, but a boatload of strategy, say, this is what I'm going to do to like cut down on all the distractions, to chunk it up a little bit and say, what are the big things and what are the little things?
This time of the year where something about turning the calendar and it feels like a clean slate and feels like this opportunity to finally do something about those areas of our life that we recognize they need some attention. This 10% really needs something. And one of the things I like about Catching Whimsy, I'd like for you to talk more about what you hope people get out of it as they read it. It's a daily devotional. But one of the things it does right at the beginning is kind of ask you to do sort of an assessment. If you could write what happened at the end of the year, what would you hope would be accomplished?
Yeah, I hope it's a tap on the shoulder from a trusted friend. It isn't like a bony finger in the face telling you what you should be doing or could be doing. It's not going to be information about the 4 words in Greek for love, agape, phileo. Like, I don't care. Just tell me about somebody who has loved you well. That was Matthew 13. It said Jesus never spoke to anybody without telling a couple stories. And so like those idea where a story would point us in the direction that, and the important part is that not that they would see whatever story I'm telling, but they would see their story in there. We aren't talking about my coach, we're talking about their coach. We're not talking about my mess up, we're talking about their mess up, or my doubts, we'll talk about their doubts. And so my hope would be just a trusted friend, a short little Devo each day to kind of get your head set, like on this idea of what are we going to do when we encounter difficult people, because they're everywhere. And then we realize I'm actually kind of difficult. I'm not as lovely as I think I am. I think I'm the easiest guy to get along with ever, but I'm actually not, truth be known. And so what I'd like people to do with a little bit of humility and some joy, and sometimes just like a tap on the shoulder from somebody who's in your corner, to say, hey, what if we were to redo this thing? Or maybe the first coin that was ever made and minted in the United States, on one side from John 17, it said, we are one. Isn't that beautiful? And then on the other side of that coin, it says, mind your business. I know this because I have that coin in. I'm not a coin collector, but I'm like, I'm keeping that thing. And then there was a person who's kind of a bit of a gadfly, and they were kind of talking about everything. And I said, hey, I've got this coin I want to give you. And I just love that we're one. And I didn't talk about the backside of the coin. I just talked about the front side. And I don't know if they walked away and never flipped that coin over, but that would be the idea that we could encourage people rather than scold people, that we could join people rather than schooling people. There's just a lot of people that are schooling one another about what they ought to do and what they ought to say or whether their belief system is right. And I'm not going light on doctrine. I just want to go so big on Jesus that if you go big on Jesus, understanding his character and his approach and the things that are written down about his life and the words that he spoke to people, man, that just brings everything together for me. So I'm not poking fun at the church. I think that's terrific. But some people that are church adjacent, the guy that works at the tire store, I want them to feel welcome. I want them to feel invited. I was in Georgia a year or two ago at a speaking thing, and I was talking about the guy at the tire store, and somebody 5 rows back stood up and threw their arms in the air and said, "I'm the guy at the tire store." And there's somebody, a Christian, somebody who is getting 5 new radials, and they gave Love Does to this guy. And they said, "This guy's coming to speak at this place. You ought to come." And so it was so fun. So I ran out and I took a picture of him. I've got my picture of the guy at the tire store. And that is the thing that motivates me when I'm writing books. I want to write to the person that feels a little bit on the outside looking in, the person that just really thinks the thing about Jesus is terrific, but it's felt obscured by some of the other things that are going on. Although I'm a lawyer by training and think I'm right all the time by training, I don't want people to meet my opinions. I want them to meet Jesus. And so sometimes that means me muzzling my opinion and keeping it in the thought bubble. And when somebody says something kind of lame or harsh, instead of pointing a finger in their direction, I just in my mind envision that escaped from their thought bubble. Like that word, that like thing. We've got a little farm at this retreat center I've got, and we have fuzzy cows there. They're called Scottish Highlands. Have you seen those?
They're adorable.
Aren't those great?
They are.
So we got one of those delivered, and I asked the guy, because we have a lot of people there that have gone through some hard things. And I said, "Is your cow nice?" And he said, he was from Texas, so he said something about tater tots and possums. I don't know. I guess what he was saying is that the cow was nice. And so I got in the pen with it, and the cow gored me, like in me, like a bullfight in me. And I thought you said your cow was nice. And he turned to me with a totally straight face and says, "She don't know she has horns." Like every mother-in-law joke right there. But I think sometimes that people that wound us, they just don't know they have horns. They think they're nuzzling us when they got a horn in our side. And so I was wondering when Paul talked about having this thorn in his side, I was thinking, oh, I bet he has a mother-in-law. Like, and not just a mother-in-law, I just insert difficult people that don't know they have horns. And so I think we're all walking with a limp. Sounds like Paul was. I know I am. And that idea, again, a tap on the shoulder to lift our eyes from some of our circumstances and say, how can we enter into today with a more correct perspective on the people and their intentions and all that? So the hope is the guy at the tire store, whoever it was that threw up his hands, would read this and it would make some sense to him.
Well, I know it inspired Guy at the Tire Store and so many others. That's one of the things I love about your books is that they inspire us not to let our limp keep us from expressing love in whimsical and wonderful ways. I'll give you an example. I would love for you to tell a story that's from Love Does, if you would. The story about you and your kids wrote letters to leaders all around the world.
Yeah, that same idea of thinking winsomely. Our kids were young at the time, and that's when 9/11 happened. And so we downloaded the CIA website. We got the name of every leader in the world. The kids wrote them a letter. And they said, Lindsay, Richard, and Adam Goff. And Adam wanted to know at, like, I think it was 7 at the time, if they wanted to come over for a sleepover. So he wrote in there, "Do you want to come over for a sleepover?" And then Richard was thinking, I wonder what they're hoping for. And so the kids said, "Do you want to come over for a sleepover? And if you can't, could we come over to your house and ask you what you're hoping for?" And then Lindsay was a precocious one, and she said, "Well, what if we get over to their house? What if we record an interview with them so we could pass that on to another world leader from them? And we'll just carry it there for them." And so we sent out these letters to every leader on earth. We got a post office box because we didn't want Ahmadinejad to know where we live. Then the leaders started responding, and most of them said no. But then the first one said yes. It was the Prime Minister of Switzerland. I remember that. And then the next one was that tiny little country right next to it, Liechtenstein. And then the next one was the President of Israel. And then the next one was, so we got yeses from 26 countries. So we pulled the kids out of school and just went. We found cheap tickets on British Airways. Every time they'd open up a new route, they'd offer these $50 tickets. So we bought them like pork belly futures. And it was really fun. Like the whole idea of these little kids, it wasn't about us. They didn't want to meet us. They wanted to meet the kids. And most of them were just really nice people with grandkids of their own. And so that idea, that would be a strategic whimsy. The leader of Malaysia was a dictator. His name is Tun Mahathir. And Mahathir had just hosted the World Islamic Conference. And he said two things. He said, death to Israel and death to the United States. And so the kids wrote to him, said, we just got back from Israel. Can we bring his message of hope to you? And so he said, sure, how about next Wednesday? So we sold the pickup truck and we flew there. And I mean, it felt a little weird, but there's something beautiful about not saying that somebody else is going to do it or the UN or whatever, just proving the concept that this is going to be the generation that is going to make the difference. And so if a kid asked me for something, I'd make time for them. And they did the same. So there's something beautiful that happens when we start showing up for one another, when we start making ourselves available, something really whimsical. And it doesn't, again, involve going across the ocean. Just go across the street. Just make it happen with your neighbor. But don't be restricted to that, right? Otherwise, I wouldn't have 6 giraffes. So to think, I wonder what would happen if, and then take these people that are on the news all the time. There's a guy that seems like a bad actor. And I had Love Does translated into his language and mailed him a case. He seems like he's in need of some encouragement. So I don't know if I'll hear back from him, but if I do, I'm going. Like that idea of just like, instead of just reading the news, why don't you participate in history? And not to draw attention to yourself at all. We wouldn't care. None of these leaders know my name, but they all know the kids. And now the kids are old enough, they can travel back and visit, and they have they're still dictators, so they're still in power. So they travel and go see them themselves. Yeah, and you just start it. And if you go hungry, thirsty, sick, strange, naked, people in jail, we have a school in Mazar al-Sharif, Afghanistan, which was the former capital of the Taliban. But just things got pretty weird over the last couple of years. But we got permission to continue to operate this girls' school, and they're still operating today. Then, with events unfolding in Afghanistan, 10,000 Afghan refugees landed in San Diego. So I don't need to go to Kabul. They came to me. We said, like, what if we could help provide for some food and all that? And so I think we started with a head of lettuce and a banana. But then it started growing, and these amazing 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds started getting involved. And now they deliver, I don't know how many tons of food every week to all these refugees from Ukraine and Afghanistan. So sometimes if we're the elder generation, we can just be helpful and then get out of people's way. So we can say, I'll spot you a truck and I'll introduce you to the guy at the food bank. I mean, then I'm going to get out of the way. And watching what they would do, I would have been an impediment. I'm not thinking as big as they're thinking. And then they just quietly just do awesome stuff. And so I think to encounter an opportunity around you and then just spin that puzzle piece and say, hey, how can I engage that? And you don't need to start a nonprofit. You don't need to make a big rule. Just get a head of lettuce. Or better, if you have a goat in San Diego for our Afghan friends, that's a big deal. It's not a good deal for the goat, but it's a great deal for them.
What is your hope when somebody picks up Catching Whimsy? What's your hope that at the end of 2025, after they've been through all those days and read those things that you've shared with them, what's your hope for that person?
Yeah, I hope that they would look back at the circle of friends that they've developed. That would be a great measure of the progress that we're making. Or the circle of friends that we have, are we going deeper? Are we showing up with something, just like that analogy of showing up at your house and bringing something with me? Do you walk into your days, whether it's in the workplace or doing the important work at home, in whatever context you operate in? Are you showing up with more joy? And more, it didn't all be yippee skippy, but just get very real about the pain points and to say, for those pain points that I can make some progress on, what are the steps for me? If that involves a counselor, awesome. Let's get a counselor. Let's get people on board that are really good at what you need, but we got to figure out first, what do I need? And that's why Jesus asked every blind guy he met, like, what do you want? So get clear about what you want. And it's not about, like, if you want a Porsche, go get two. You won't like the insurance bill, but most of us want love and acceptance. Most of us want something to have a life that's lasting, right? And then to do something about it. I personally find writing books very tedious. I'm kind of like Tigger, like I want to be around people and all that. And when it comes to like words, they're all spelled differently. And it's like, that's a lot of words to write down. Hundreds of thousands of words end up in a devotional. And yet the plan is that when I'm no longer around, that some of these words will have some shelf life in somebody's life, a great grandkid who I'll never meet or something. I want people to operate with that kind of expectation, not just yippee skippy kind of joy, but a strategic whimsy where there's a strategy. So if I'm in a jar someday, I want something leaning up against it, or maybe a snow globe. I haven't decided.
That would be fitting.
Yeah, I look through the mirror dimly. Yeah, but to approach some of these things with a maturity and with a joy and a sense of anticipation, it'll keep you young. It will. I've seen some people that look older than their chronological age. I think they just stop being curious. And that idea of catching some whimsy to say, instead of making my life better, you know that phrase, if God answered every prayer that you had, would anybody's life except yours get better? And so to say, okay, so how can it be outward looking? Get your head on a swivel, say, where's a need? And then how could I intersect that with some joy? How could I intersect that with anticipation? I'm going to learn a ton along the way. And if I'm hesitant to do that, what's that connected to? Like, what's the story I've been telling me? Is that a bug on the window or is that a 747? And then once you figure out which pile it goes in, now we can do something with it. I like it. Jesus asked 307 questions during his 3 years of public ministry, but he only answered 3. Isn't that awesome? Somebody asked, will you teach us how to pray? And he said, yes. A lawyer like me asked him, what's the big commandment? And then in front of Herod, they said, I hear you're the king of the Jews. Is that true? And he said, yes, I am. And I love that idea that in 3 years, he only felt like he just needed to answer 3 questions, but he could ask a ton of them. That would make a great devotional. I haven't put that one in the book, but wouldn't that be a great devotional? Write your own. I would say, as you're wrapping this up, don't read my book, write yours. Or read one of my devos and then write one of your devos. I'm telling you, will blow your kids' mind. Like, they would love to hear what you have to see, how you see the world, what you're puzzled about. I love Mark 9. There's a dad like me that just asked an honest question. He said, I believe, just help me with all the parts I don't believe right now. And that would be the guy at the tire store. And if that's you, man, I'm telling you, you don't need more information. What you need is to find more examples in your life, examples in your own life that are unfolding where God's shown up. This idea of remember shows up in the scriptures 8,670 times. And so that idea of just remembering times where God feels like he's shown up in your life. And if you're facing some uncertainty, I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I do know what's happened in the past, and to just remember that.
Bob and his family just planned and hosted the 27th annual New Year's Day parade in their neighborhood. It starts at the cul-de-sac down the street, it ends in their front yard, and it has grown from 8 people the first year to more than 400 balloon-carrying friends and neighbors. The whole point of the parade is simple: to love their neighbors. It's a perfect example of the strategic whimsy that Bob talks about. If you're listening to Bob and thinking, wow, I could use some whimsy in my life, well, you might want to pick up a copy of his latest book. It's called Catching Whimsy, 365 Days of Possibility. It's a perfect book to start this year, inspiring you to live a life of adventure, following Jesus, giving and receiving his love. Bob is the founder of Love Does, a nonprofit human rights organization operating in countries like Uganda, Afghanistan, and in conflict zones around the world. You can learn more about that at lovedoes.org and learn more about Bob's speaking, coaching, and writing at bobgoff.com. I am so grateful to Bob for sharing his story. Thanks to the Unfolding team, Lindsay Caparoon, Michael Schermack, our producer and network director, Jason Rackow. The Unfolding is a Wow God production. Discover more at wowgod.com.